Seems like South Africa is following in the footsteps of Burkina Faso and Niger and Senegal. They have ordered the American ambassador to South Africa to leave with immediate effect. That's right, South Africans' balls are growing. And you know what? South Africa has now more powerful friends. And we never thought that would live to see the time that an African country would take on America.
Is my view. I just don't understand why we are taking a bunch of tools in our foreign policy toolbox and tossing them into a dumpster.
And I think we need to start giving African countries more of what they want and less of what they don't. That seems like an obvious proposition, but frequently our Africa strategy doesn't seem to be guided by that principle.
If people want to leave South Africa because we're demanding our land, bye-bye. You are free to go. No one is holding a gun on your head. But we can guarantee you, you will come back because we are going to flourish with or without you.
The announcement did not arrive through spectacle, but through protocol, a formal. Was released by South Africa's foreign ministry, written in careful language that avoided emotion while delivering an unmistakable message. The diplomatic accreditation of the United States representative had been withdrawn. The ambassador was instructed to depart. What followed was not chaos, but shock. For decades, relations between South Africa and the United States had been layered, complex, and often pragmatic. Trade ties, security cooperation, and diplomatic engagement had survived ideological differences and global shifts. That history made the decision feel unprecedented. Diplomatic expulsions between major partners were rare, and when they happened, they signaled deeper fractures beneath the surface. Washington reacted with disbelief. Officials emphasized the strength of bilateral relations and called the move unexpected. Behind closed doors, the tone was different. Analysts recognized that this was not an isolated incident, but the culmination of mounting tension. Statements made, positions taken, and pressures applied over time had finally crossed a threshold. South Africa framed the decision as sovereign. The official explanation cited violations of diplomatic norms and a breakdown of mutual respect. The language avoided accusation while making clear that the relationship as it stood was no longer sustainable. The message was directed not only outward but inward. Domestic audiences were reminded that foreign policy would no longer be managed from a position of deference. Across Africa, reactions were swift and telling. Governments did not rush to condemn or endorse. Instead, they watched. South Africa's position as a regional and continental leader gave the move weight. If a country with deep economic ties to the United States was willing to draw such a line, it suggested a broader shift in diplomatic posture across the continent. The crisis did not emerge overnight. Tensions had been building around trade disputes, political commentary, and differing approaches to global alignment. South Africa had increasingly emphasized strategic autonomy, deepening ties with non-Western partners and asserting independent positions in multilateral forums. Washington, accustomed to influence through engagement, and pressure, appeared slow to adjust. The expulsion changed the tone instantly. Embassies across Africa reassessed their communications. Diplomatic language became more cautious. The assumption that disagreements could be managed quietly behind closed doors no longer held. In the United States, the incident ignited political debate. Some framed it as an affront, questioning South Africa's reliability as a partner. Others argued it reflected a failure to respect shifting global realities. The idea that African nations were no longer passive participants in international relations gained traction, unsettling those accustomed to older hierarchies. South Africa's domestic response was measured. There were no mass celebrations, no dramatic speeches. Officials emphasized continuity, stability, and openness to dialogue under new terms. The expulsion was presented not as hostility, but as boundary setting. Economic implications were debated intensely. Markets reacted with caution rather than panic. Trade flows did not halt. Investment did not flee. This restraint reinforced South Africa's message. The decision was targeted, not reckless. Diplomatic relations could be recalibrated without collapsing economic cooperation. Africa's broader diplomatic landscape shifted perceptibly. Countries that had long navigated relationships with major powers through quiet compromise began to reconsider their strategies. The South African move demonstrated that assertiveness did not automatically invite isolation. In some cases, it commanded respect. The United States faced a strategic dilemma. Responding harshly risked validating perceptions of coercion. Responding softly risked appearing weakened. The balance between maintaining influence and adapting to a multipolar world became harder to manage. South Africa's alignment choices came under scrutiny. Observers linked the crisis to the country's growing engagement with alternative power centers. Trade, security cooperation, and development finance increasingly reflected diversification rather than dependence. The expulsion symbolized this evolution more clearly than any policy. Paper, at international forums, the tone shifted. South Africa spoke with renewed confidence, emphasizing equality among states and resistance to external pressure. Its position resonated with many countries that had long felt constrained by unspoken expectations. The diplomatic crisis reverberated beyond bilateral ties. It raised questions about how influence was exercised in the modern era. Was it through persuasion and partnership, or through assumption and leverage? South Africa's action suggested the former was becoming indispensable. Washington's shock gradually gave way to analysis. The incident was no longer viewed as a single diplomatic rupture, but as part of a pattern. Africa's role in global affairs was expanding, and with it, a willingness to assert interests openly. As the first phase of the crisis unfolded, one reality became clear. The expulsion was not the end of relations, but the end of an old dynamic. South Africa had signaled that engagement with global powers would proceed on revised terms, grounded in mutual respect rather than inherited influence. And as diplomats packed their bags and policy analysts rewrote briefings, the message echoed far beyond Pretoria and Washington. Africa was no longer content to be managed. It was prepared to manage its own place in the world. The consequences unfolded far beyond the immediate diplomatic shock. When South Africa formalized the expulsion and the embassy gates closed to a senior representative of the United States, the action did not remain confined to Pretoria or Washington. It rippled outward through markets, alliances, and assumptions that had shaped relations. For decades, what initially appeared as a bilateral dispute quickly revealed itself as a broader test of influence, respect, and shifting global balance. In the United States, the response moved through stages. The first was disbelief. South Africa had long been treated as a strategic partner, a regional anchor, and a voice of moderation within Africa. The idea that such a country would take a step traditionally reserved for hostile states unsettled policymakers. Briefings emphasized confusion more than anger. Analysts searched for explanations that could frame the expulsion as an anomaly rather than a signal. The second stage was defensiveness. Statements emphasized sovereignty, protocol, and the right of the United States to express its positions freely, yet the tone revealed strain. The expulsion had not followed the usual script of warnings, negotiations, or quiet de-escalation. It had arrived decisively, framed as a response to accumulated grievances rather than a single incident. South Africa's messaging remained consistent. Officials stressed dignity, mutual respect, and the limits of tolerance. The expulsion was described not as a break with the United States, but as a correction. Diplomatic engagement, they argued, could not function if one party assumed exemption from consequence. Africa observed closely. Across the continent, governments noted the clarity of South Africa's stance. For years, African countries had navigated relationships with major powers by absorbing pressure, criticism, or disregard in exchange for aid, access, or security guarantees. South Africa's move suggested a different posture, one grounded in parity rather than dependency. Regional reactions varied in tone but aligned in substance. Some countries expressed concern about escalation, others emphasized the importance of sovereignty and mutual respect. None condemned South Africa outright. That silence carried meaning. It reflected a broader recalibration in how African states viewed their diplomatic leverage. The European Union approached the situation cautiously. Statements urged dialogue and restraint, careful not to side explicitly with either party. Yet behind closed doors, diplomats acknowledged the precedent. If South Africa could expel a senior representative of the United States without immediate isolation, the diplomatic landscape had shifted. Economic implications followed swiftly. Markets reacted not with panic, but with reassessment. South Africa's currency experienced volatility, but not collapse. Investors weighed the risks against fundamentals. The absence of immediate economic retaliation from the United States surprised some observers, reinforcing the perception that blunt responses might backfire. Trade relationships remained intact, exports continued, contracts were honored. This continuity weakened arguments that diplomatic assertiveness would inevitably carry catastrophic costs. Instead, it suggested that economic interdependence constrained escalation on both sides. In Washington, internal debates intensified. Some voices called for firmness, warning that failure to respond decisively would embolden others. Others argued that overreaction would validate South Africa's grievances and accelerate the erosion of influence. The divide reflected a deeper uncertainty about how power functioned in a more multipolar world. South Africa leveraged the moment carefully. Rather than amplifying confrontation, it emphasized continuity in cooperation areas such as trade, education, and multilateral engagement. The message was deliberate. Disagreement did not equal hostility. Boundaries could be enforced without severing ties. China and Russia watched attentively. Neither rushed to comment publicly, but both recognized opportunity. The episode illustrated how diplomatic space was widening for countries willing to assert autonomy. It reinforced the appeal of diversified partnerships over exclusive alignment. African multilateral forums discussed the implications. The expulsion became a case study in diplomatic agency. Legal frameworks, norms, and risks were analyzed. The conclusion many reached was cautious but clear. Assertiveness carried risk, but passivity carried certainty of marginalization. The United States faced a reputational challenge. For decades, its diplomats had operated with an assumption of deference in many regions. The South Africa episode challenged that assumption. It suggested that respect was no longer automatic, even among long-standing partners. Public opinion within South Africa largely supported the decision. Commentary emphasized national dignity and the right to define acceptable diplomatic conduct. While concerns about economic fallout were voiced, they did not dominate the discourse. The narrative centered on equality rather than defiance. The crisis influenced diplomatic behavior elsewhere. Officials from various countries adjusted tone, aware that missteps could provoke stronger responses than in the past. Protocol regained importance. Listening replaced lecturing in some engagements. The subtle shift reflected learning rather than capitulation. Washington's eventual response was measured. Diplomatic channels remained open. Emphasis shifted toward rebuilding trust. The absence of immediate punitive action signaled recognition that the old playbook was less effective. Influence, it became clear, could not be sustained through assumption alone. South Africa's regional standing strengthened. The country was increasingly viewed as a voice capable of articulating African concerns without retreating under pressure. This perception enhanced its role in negotiations far beyond the immediate dispute. The broader lesson extended beyond any single country. Global diplomacy was entering a phase where symbolic acts carried structural weight. Expelling a representative was no longer just a dramatic gesture. It was a declaration of agency in a system adjusting to distributed power. As weeks passed, the crisis settled into a new normal. Embassies continued to operate, trade flowed, multilateral meetings resumed, yet the memory of the expulsion lingered, shaping expectations on both sides. For the United States, the episode underscored a difficult truth. Financial strength, military reach, and historical influence did not guarantee unquestioned diplomatic latitude. Engagement required adaptation to partners increasingly confident in their own leverage. For South Africa, the outcome validated a calculated risk. By asserting boundaries without collapsing cooperation, it demonstrated that sovereignty could be defended without isolation. That example resonated across Africa and beyond. In the end, the diplomatic crisis did not erupt into rupture. It crystallized into a signal that the era of automatic deference was fading, a signal that respect had become transactional, earned through conduct rather than assumed through status. And as the global system absorbed that signal, it became clear that the real shift was not about one expulsion, but about a changing understanding of power, one where even the most established players had to listen, adjust, and share space in a world no longer shaped by a single voice.